Hi, I'm Anders, and this is Open Source Made Simple. Yeah, sure. I'm Anders, and I work as a developer advocate for Styra, which is the creators of the open source project, the Open Policy Agent, which is it's a policy engine which allows you to kind of write rules and policy around to build guardrails around your clusters, infrastructure, authorization, and so on. So it's a it's a general purpose tool. So it's kind of applicable in a lot of domains.
And that's what is OPA, or as I like to call it, OPA, about? What is this project about?
Right. So at its core, it kind of allows you to decouple and reason about your rules, uh, sort of in the same way as you would kind of decouple things like storage, move that out of your applications, and kind of manage that from a centralized location, and then kind of work on policy, test your policy in isolation from your and of course uh, have your policy lifecycle kind of kept separate from that of your application or business logic. So that's kind of the heart of what OPA does. And again, it's a general purpose tool, so it has a lot of use cases, and there's a lot of things that OPA has been used for and is used for. And yeah, I think like the most common one is probably authorization, where OPA determines should a user be allowed or not, based on the policy you have loaded and optionally maybe some data like roles or permissions and so on. Another fairly common use case is like Kubernetes admission control, where OPA determines should this resource be allowed to be deployed or not. There's policy around infrastructure for Terraform or AWS CloudFormation, and so on. So basically, anywhere where you have rules, you can use OPA. And the benefit of doing that, rather than having like hard-coded rules or rules that are written inside of your applications, is again that this kind of decoupling allows you to reason about your rules from one central location, rather than having it kind of scattered around like in different programming languages, frameworks, and so on.
And that's my audience is mostly beginner folks who are starting out with open source, starting with development. So could you please break down what do you mean when you say a policy?
Yeah, of course. So a policy in OPA is pretty much the same thing as a policy in real world. It's basically a set of rules. So you might, for example, say that in order to deploy this pod to your Kubernetes cluster, it must have this or that attribute. It must have a label which says who owns this pod, or who is responsible for this pod. Maybe it's a team or a developer, but it could also be things like security configurations, like pod security policies or whatnot. So the way it works is any application as a Kubernetes, it could either be like the Kubernetes API or a custom application. It rather than making that decision on its own, it forwards that request over to OPA, where OPA makes a decision, sends it back, and then that decision is enforced by the application. So that's basically what a policy is, and that's what OPA does. It makes decisions based on policy.
How does this work? Can you please elaborate on this a bit more? How does OPA work?
Yeah, sure. So our policies in OPA, they're written in a declarative language, which is called Rego. So it needs to be fairly general purpose. So it's a declarative language where you describe uh, what you want done rather than exactly how you want it done. So you might say that if this or that attribute is is present, it needs to have one of these values. Or if a user access tries to access this endpoint, it needs to have this role assigned, and so on and so forth. So that's basically like what policy is, and how OPA works with policy.
OPA is a CNCF graduated project. So what does that mean for OPA? And what does that mean for the OPA community?
Oh, I think it means a lot. Basically means that there's a strong foundation kind of backing up the project. Uh, and yeah, I think like OPA is not just a project in the CNCF or in the Cloud Native Foundation, but is also a project which is used in a lot of these other projects in the Cloud Native Foundation. So it's basically a policy engine which is kind of prevalent in so much of the Cloud Native world.
So, what does it take for a project to come from incubation stage to graduation stage?
Oh, I can't say honestly. I was too involved in that, but I know there's a whole bunch of requirements where you need to have like X number of GitHub stars. You need to have like you need to show like there's a certain amount of production users and so on and so forth. But I don't know. I'm not too sure about like all of the specifics for that. But yeah, there's a long list of requirements for that. So it basically shows that OPA is battle tested. It has a huge large or user base and a lot of production applications.
Can beginner folks contribute to OPA?
Oh yeah, for sure. We have over 300 contributors, and a lot of those contributions come from like our end users. I'd say it's even the majority. So people find something. It could either be a bug, it could be a typo in the docs, or whatnot, and yeah, and we take it from there. It's we try and be very kind of helpful and accommodating to new contributors. So so yeah, I'd say it's definitely doable. But I think like in terms of like in general for like open source contributions, I think one key is to actually use the project. And then I'm not too sure about like this kind of where projects are just trying to find like contributors as a means to an end. I think like the best contributions are from people where they've actually used OPA and they found something missing or they found an issue with something they were using it for, and then they kind of built their contribution on that.
So, does OPA also have any Discord or Slack channel or any meetings, monthly
Yeah,
or weekly?
yeah. There's a few kind of forums for contributors. There's the OPA Slack, which has I think there's like 7,000 members. So that's a great way to kind of get familiar with the OPA community. There's a there's a sorry, there's a specific channel, contributors, which is only for contributors. So that's a good place to go in and discuss. There's also like a GitHub discussion board, and yeah, and there's Stack Overflow and whatnot. So if there's some preferred way of kind of communicating, I think we're probably there.
So, how do you suggest that folks can navigate around a big project like OPA? How can they start and understand the project basically?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have some pretty good docs on kind of the onboarding process, how to get involved, what are the requirements for a new PR, and so on. So I just started the README, and then there are links to various kind of docs on how to contribute, what's expected of a new contribution, and so on. But also, like again, the Slack is a great way to ask questions and so on.
Can they start their open source journey by contributing to a big project like OPA?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's it's pretty much how I started my contributing to open source. I've contributed to a few projects before, but OPA was really like the first project where I was a heavy user, and we found a lot of things that we wanted to improve and so on in the organization I was in there at that time. So yeah, we created a few issues and then kind of figured out like if we want something done here, we might as well like kind of pull our sleeves up and try and do something about it. So we started contributing and kind of yeah got the ball rolling from there.
So, what is the ideal way to start contributing to a big project? See, everybody's at a different level. So there cannot be a perfect answer to this. But keeping in mind a general answer, like what's the ideal way to start to make your first contribution to OPA?
Yeah. And again, I think, like, to me at least, the best way to contribute is to actually use a project. And contributions aren't necessarily in the form of code, right? So if you find something missing in the docs, or you find something like, this isn't really clear to me, how do I do this? And then you create an issue around that, and maybe somebody else can improve on that part of the docs, or even change the code somehow. But just by creating that issue, saying that I found this very confusing, or I didn't know how to do this or that, because, like, uh, the command line tool didn't tell me, or the docs were not searchable, or so on. That's also a contribution, which is very valuable. So there are many ways of contributing, but I think at the heart of it, I think, to actually use a project and to be involved in that project before you kind of approach this idea of contributing to it, I think that's, to me, it means, like, the most valuable contributions kind of come from that place. And I also think it's more valuable kind of long term to build a community of users, and not just people who kind of drop by that and want to contribute to something. Like, that's absolutely fine, of course, if that's what you want. But I think those people tend to kind of, they come by, they might find a typo in the doc or something, they fix that, and which is great. But and then they just kind of they move on to the next project to contribute there, which, it's it's any contribution is good. But I think for, like, the long-term success of a project, what you really want is to kind of build this community of end users, where where even things like, just, again, like, just, hey, this isn't very clear to me, I don't know how to do this, and I couldn't find it in the docs. That's also a valuable thing to kind of raise. But that obviously requires that you actually use the project or product.